Re:Zero, Arc 9, Chapter 12, Starlight Beyond the Realm of a Billion.
Expand territory, matrix redefinition. A fixed catchphrase was a declaration of war against the world, so had once spoken a witch. Magic was a technique that reflected one's will into reality, defying the laws of nature by means of incantation. A sophisticated, delicate act of barbarism tantamount to forcibly rewriting the script, altering the ending. That was to say, the incantations of magic spells were none other than a polite greeting that declared, "Now I shall destroy the world." Of course, since it was a greeting, there were times it would be ignored, or rejected, if the formulation of the technique was not fully fleshed out, if the activation was messed up due to a lack of mana, or if it spontaneously fired bringing about a result unlike the one desired. There were various things that could happen. To begin with, this parable itself was naught more than a digression. That which he was attempting to perform was not magic. Only, if saying a catchphrase was a declaration of war against the world, then its essence was merely the same. That was exactly why. Expand territory, matrix redefinition. That was a forewarning of murder towards a world that wished not to be destroyed, from one who wished to destroy it nonetheless. Kill. Destroy. Rip. Trample. Flatten. Desecrate. Tear. Mangle. Incinerate. Crush. Smash. Liquefy. Saturate. Any word was fine. It was the same as magic. What mattered was for the essence to be the same. As long as the concluding words remained unchanged, he would use any method necessary. No matter what happened, no matter how things went, no matter what it took, Natsuki Subaru would be removed. That conclusion was the only thing he absolutely would not change. For that purpose, expand territory, matrix redefinition. Even if that starlight laid beyond the realm of a billion, he would definitely reach it. 4061. The one most laborious to remove from the board had been the Margrave, with his unexpectedly jestful antics. The Margrave, highly perceptive and veteran of the battlefields as he was, would not be emotionally swayed by any sob stories whatsoever, especially when considering the severity of his attitude towards the camp, no, towards all that would not stand to benefit him. Considering the circumstances, seeing that he was unable to present anything that was in the Margrave's benefit, he'd had no choice but to conclude that obtaining the latter's agreement by dangling a carrot in front of him was a lost cause. But, having a keen sense for profits and losses often meant that one would sniff out any drawbacks more successfully than the average person. Therefore, the optimal path would be to give the impression that losses would be had, were the Margrave to not follow his lead. Once this direction was realized, it became easier to then undo the tangled threads. Although ultimately taking advantage of the situation Schult had been placed into was nothing that did not bring him feelings of guilt, for the sake of avoiding discord in the Bariel domain from here on after, someone else's hand would need to be borrowed. By all means, lay down your claim as you please, it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 972. The 1 second most difficult to handle had been the Oni sisters, with the eldest in particular having been a formidable adversary. From the onset, he had already known in advance that vigilance was indispensable against her. Averting her intuition, keen to the point of abnormality, had been no trivial feat. However, a clear compromise had existed in her case. The little sister, dispossessed of memories, with whom she had finally been reunited, being the biggest weak point of someone with nary an opening to be found. She had wished to return with her precious younger sister back to their base as quickly as possible. As awareness of this had always been present, possessing a method with which to nudge that forth would a positive. But, being that the balancing act between blatantness and nonchalantness had been of truly fiendish difficulty, unceasingly heading towards a goal he could not at all reach had been troublesome. And finally, though her caution had been lower compared to the eldest, the young sister, having built herself up on top of her lost memories through many twists and turns in the Empire, and having forged a bond that she would not display openly, remained a daunting enemy as well. Making use of their sisterly love brings pain to my heart, but it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 633. The one most challenging to extract emotional understanding from, had been the Internal Affairs Minister, unsparing to outsiders as he was. Contrary to his soft looks, he was the owner of a tough personality, and misinterpreting him as a pushover could lead to one getting burnt. He was an opponent that forced one to feel apprehension akin to going up against a horned bull. The way to put him on the ropes had been similar to what had been employed with the Margrave, but because he was much more humane compared to the latter, by bringing up a pragmatic common ground, conditions were worked out, forcing him to give a yes, no weapons, an interval of 3 days, and their trusted military officer accompanying them. All were restrictions that, due to being only natural, hurted not. Desiring even more than that from him would be perilous, he had been made aware of this 100 times. After all, this was an opponent that, once dialogue was shut off, all hopes of reopening it would be gone. For him, too, the clincher had been selfsame. Making him consider the person who would feel morally responsible for his unstable self's departure. Exploiting his kindness makes me bitter, but it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 94, though the number of attempts was small, omitting the one with rare blood from the traveling companions headed for the Sand Sea had been an absolute necessity. The possessor of flawlessly refined rare blood would have offered to be a companion as soon as possible if left unattended. He had no doubts or averse feelings towards her humanity and abilities, but the blood flowing through her veins would have served to hinder his objectives. But the quickest and most reliable method to nudge someone deeply compassionate in the desired direction was to make use of their compassion. Once knowing their sense of belonging to a group, and knowing of their considerable dislike for going against the flow, it had not been difficult to pull them along a path that was easy to follow. At this point, he could say that he had a good idea of the majority of the relationships within the camp, those whom he had never met included. Were she made to believe that a bad pairing would be left behind as a result of her accompanying the party, and that would become a burden to the young child feeling forlorn, she would take the initiative and strive to resolve that issue. The idea was not to make the impossible possible. It was to actualize those non-zero possibilities. I don't have comforting words to offer, but it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 5. Given that he was deeply familiar with how to manipulate her heart, quite honestly, it had been a piece of cake. Compassionate and benevolent, and likewise overflowing with thoughtfulness, she was quite easy to deceive, and not knowing how to doubt the words coming from him, her nature was that of taking things as frank and veracious. By all measures, her magnanimity was such that he should not have messed up even one time. Ergo, the reason for his failures had not been any problem regarding her, but a problem regarding himself. It was a matter of him having been hesitant to deceive her, to twist her thoughts to suit his preferences. Were he to disregard the creaking of his heart, filling her amethyst eyes with grief would be easy. To begin with, she was someone who had been attempting to empathize with his wounds. If he were to appeal to her in regards to the best thing she could do for the sake of her, she would naturally settle on that resolve. More and more am I becoming unable to save myself, but it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 0. And, in regards to Natsuki Subaru, he did not fail even once. He knew Natsuki Subaru through and through, and thus not a single shred of hesitation had existed within him. It was merely that he had only needed to assess the timing correctly. After all, old Shamak, when it came to requirements, dragging Beatrice into this trump card had been a matter of the utmost priority. Due to the unfamiliar incantation and the formulation of a never-before-seen technique, Beatrice's reaction had been delayed by a beat, and since she was what had been protecting Natsuki Subaru, a fatal opening had arisen. Instantaneously pulling his arm closer to her, and moving to attempt a response, could be called a paragon of contract spirits, and that had been Aldebaran's true aim. Aldebaran, 3 days. With 3 days, there'd be some caution that something might happen on the 3rd day. Old Shamak, something of an anti-witch trump card, was a forbidden technique that aimed to forcibly seal shut its target's gate, preventing even their movements through restraints and a spell seal. In the sense that it was a technique whose existence had been prohibited from being revealed, even the witch who had created it herself had avoided writing it down, passing it on only orally, and that too, had been limited to only Aldebaran. Perhaps the reason why the witch had bequeathed this forbidden art, which was capable of killing even her, to Aldebaran exclusively had not been because of any affection or trust in her student. Rather, she had done so due to nothing more than holding the logical belief that Aldebaran would not err in his usage of the technique, and that he would not employ it in any other way but to fulfill its purpose. Aldebaran, the corollary of that, is that a person would let their guard down the most right after a nice chat on the evening of the first day. In truth, Aldebaran had never harbored the thought of directing this forbidden technique against the witch, or against any other witch, and had never done so in actual fact. Or, to be more precise, neither had he ever directed towards the person he ought to have employed it on. In other words, the forbidden technique she had devised and imparted unto him had at last seen the light of day. Aldebaran, I understand, bro. No, Natsuki Subaru. I won't kill you. In the midst of the battle against the great disaster, he had tried to use it as a trump card against Sphinx, who had proclaimed herself a witch, but there had been an issue stemming from Sphinx's end due to the absence of a witch factor. It had been unable to display its true speciality. Therefore, this moment marked the very first time that the forbidden technique of old Shamak had been activated properly. Aldebaran, he used his fingers to pick up what had fallen to the ground, something that appeared to be a glass sphere of sable hue. Within the orb that did not allow its interior to be seen, Natsuki Subaru and Beatrice had been confined together. As she was a great spirit of the yin attribute, it would have been problematic for Beatrice to analyze the forbidden technique. At the time he had enclosed her within the range of the magic, it had been a gamble whether or not she would also be included as a target of the forbidden art. But he had won the gamble. Contracted with Natsuki Subaru, and sharing in his gate, Beatrice became a target of the technique, and her existence was now sealed within the orb. It had been troublesome to build the situation up to this point. But troublesome was all that it had been. She's no longer among us. That's why, Aldebaran, it's starting, teacher. So that I may be myself. Indeed, it happened just after Aldebaran declared so with resolve. Ora, raising a tremendous battle cry, kicking off and splitting apart the floor of the library, a golden beast leapt at him with speed akin to an arrow. His upraised arm, stout and flexible, was charged with so much strength that it would pulverize Aldebaran in a single blow were it to connect, completely dispossessing him of his ability to take action in less than a second. It was likely that even in the case of it just grazing his shoulder instead of his head, that Herculean strength would be enough to strip away more than half of his consciousness. However, that would only come to pass were a punch to be thrown. Aldebaran, HK, ? You bastard. The ferocious beast charged at extreme speed, and although Garfield's emerald green eyes were blazing with scintillating fury, instead of swinging at Aldebaran, he grabbed him by the arm and pinned him down to the library floor. Being forced down by that sheer might without having taken a defensive stance, Aldebaran choked out a cry of pain as his jaw struck the floor. Ignoring that cry, Garfield, pressing his knee against his opponent's back, bared his fangs. Garfield, the fuck do you do to Captain Beatrice? Where are they? That magic earlier, Aldebaran, you got it wrong, Garf-chan. Garfield, AHH. When faced with Garfield's attempts to interrogate him, Aldebaran responded in a low voice. That caused an angered timbre to come out of Garfield's throat, but such a threat bore no meaning. In the first place, this dialogue itself bore no meaning whatsoever. Aldebaran, rather than pinning me down, the first thing you should have done is knock me out. While providing a sincere response to that meaningless dialogue, Aldebaran slid his tongue around within his mouth. Then, ignoring Garfield's perplexed reaction to his words, Aldebaran unwrapped the drug package that had been prepared behind his molar, and gulped it down. Then, as tremendous heat caused the blood throughout Aldebaran's body to boil, Ora, kicking off the floor with explosive vigor, a ferocious beast charged forth with speed akin to an arrow. But that ferocious beast was not aiming to strike Aldebaran, but to grab his arm and hold him down. That moment, he dodged the incoming arm, and raised his elbow. Garfield, goer, Aldebaran. With this, his opponent's vigor would be hindered. Right after Aldebaran had thought so, an impact struck his torso. Garfield had received a blow to his nose from his own momentum colliding with Aldebaran's elbow, and unleashed a kick despite his nose bleeding. its singular strike demolishing Aldebaran's hip bone, sending the latter flying backwards. Becoming incapacitated would have been problematic. Garfield, bastard. Aldebaran, next. Collapsing together with several bookshelves, he unwrapped the drug package while buried in a mountain of books. The shock perforated his entire body. Times. Question mark. Ora! A ferocious beast charged forth in tandem with a battle cry, and as he dodged its arm, he flicked his elbow upward in response. Supposing he merely struck his opponent's nose like this, then the outcome would be the same as earlier. And although he understood this, Aldebaran had no means of evading a front kick unleashed with that speed. In that case, he just had to make sure that no front kick could be performed. Question mark. Gobaka? Upon the elbow that was about to collide with the charging face, he had placed a rock protector, swinging with force akin to striking a pickle stone. He slammed it into his opponent's nose. As his nose basked in a counter that made use of his own momentum, Garfield was knocked back into midair, his nosebleed spraying everywhere as he flew past Aldebaran's flank. Aldebaran, with this, Garfield tumbled onto the floor and crashed into a shelf, causing him to be buried alive by the books falling out from therein. While catching that in the corner of his eyes, Aldebaran took a huge leap backwards, confident he had succeeded in avoiding the first attack. Thereupon, question mark. El Shiha, having just stepped back onto the floor, Aldebaran's entire body grew sluggish after that short incantation was weaved. No, it had not grown sluggish. His entire body had been engulfed by a sense of immobility. The source of Aldebaran's immobility was a vast amount of water, something entirely out of place in a library. Question mark. Excuse my poor manners in deliberately doing such a thing whilst knowing full well that moisture is the greatest enemy of books. Aldebaran, HK. Question mark. However, producing a source of fire would have been unreasonable. Wind would have devastated the library, and earth would have soiled the books. Thus, I had wanted to avoid using them. I want it to be understood that I made a bitter decision in the heat of the moment. Well then, the reasoning for why I had selected water is as I just explained, but, with these words, the small individual with their hand upraised towards him, Ezo Kadna, waved his black cloak as he made a slow approach. Rather than that being him putting on airs, the reason was tactical, a magician's strategy to maintain vigilance on their opponent's movements. He was honored to be treated with such caution, but it did not seem like he would be able to meet those expectations. After all, enveloping Aldebaran was the minimum amount of water needed to cover his body completely, as if he was being fitted with a bodysuit made of water. He was dispossessed of both his freedom to breathe and freedom to move his body. Against that extraordinary capacity for magic, Aldebaran bore no means of contending. However, while Ezo maintained a fixed distance with Aldebaran, Ezo, Aldono, may I ask to hear an explanation to help me understand your side of the story? What was that earlier, that magic that is unknown to even me? More importantly, what happened to Natsuki Dono and Miss Beatrice? They were both worried that you might fall into despair and neglect your own self. To those two, 106, Ezo swiftly provided correct, sound reasoning that could rightly be called an adult's perspective. Contrary to his juvenile appearance, Ezo Kadna was a surprisingly honest and sincere person. He would return sincerity with sincerity, and respond to respect with respect, such was the earnestness ingrained in his roots. Therefore, when facing off against Ezo, it was absolutely indispensable to have sincerity and respect. As long as that was maintained, he would remain passive no matter what. His personality was that of expecting far too much from others. In that regard, his way of being fundamentally differed from that of Roswell, despite them both being magicians. If it were Roswell, he would swiftly scorch Aldebaran's limbs, ravage his lungs with wind to rob him of his consciousness, and take away his freedom by imprisoning him in earth, all the while not paying mind to how he was impacting the books of the dead. Ezo would not do that. That was why, Ezo, HK, such a foolish act. Cutting off his words, as Ezo yelled with a stiff expression, Aldebaran's face within the watery membrane was clouded over by a hue of deep red. It was evidence that he had regurgitated his roasted, melted viscera, having passed through his throat and out his mouth. Without delay, Ezo undid the magic restraint, and attempted to shift gears to healing magic, but it was already too late. By the time he had thought it in his head, he was no longer able to catch up to Aldebaran. Question mark, El Shiha, question mark, El Donea. Compared to the graceful and refined incantation, his was an unshapely incantation without a fragment of elegance. But, activated while he was panting, the clumsy earthen armor quickly covered Aldebaran's body, and as to override the delicate film of water, it absorbed all the liquid. Question mark, what? The earthen armor was instantly converted to armor of mud, allowing Aldebaran to resume stepping on the floor, an action that ought to have been obstructed, before leaping backwards as his armor fell apart. While his heels slid across the library floor, he withdrew to a farther position, gaining a clear line of sight on the two who were directing hostility toward him. Ezo, remaining vigilant towards him, and Garfield, buried under the books from a collapsed shelf. Question mark, don't fuck with me. Thrusting his arm out of the mountain of books, Garfield made his comeback while pushing away the collapsed bookshelf. Stepping forth with large strides so as to not tread on the fallen books, he glared at Aldebaran, wiping off the blood smeared on his snout with the back of his hand. The bleeding ceased in just a few seconds. From the very roots of their existences, the combat strength of his body was fundamentally different from Aldebaran's. Dragging his burly, stout body forward, Garfield was about to advance further towards him. Ezo, please wait, Garfield-kun. It would be perilous to approach heedlessly. Garfield, This really the time to be saying that, Sensei-san? Captain and Beatrice got done in by that fucking incomprehensible ball. As soon as possible, I gotta, Ezo, that is precisely why. That sort of magic, even I do not have knowledge of it. And above all else, he has just displayed that he is able to perfectly endure both of our attacks. It is abnormal. Garfield, Ezo, not once have I ever revealed my cards to him. And yet, he was able to perfectly deal with the water binding by soaking it up with earth. This cannot be explained as him merely being skilled in the art of war. Act with composure. You and I are the only ones here capable of restraining him. Keeping the hot-headed Garfield in check, Ezo adjusted his voice to a tone of composure. It was clear that Ezo's words were persuasive, as the rage and agitation on Garfield's expression gradually subsided. Above all else, it was Ezo's insight, perceiving and alluding to a fragment of Aldebaran's cheatability as a sense of unease through just a single bout of combat, that was abnormal. As a matter of fact, Ezo's words were correct. No matter how much he had attempted to come up with an ingenious solution, he did not have any way to omit Ezo and Flam, who had already arrived at the tower, or Garfield, who was accompanying them as the result of a compromise reached with the Emilia camp. But, at the same time, it could be said that he had succeeded in suppressing the opponent's forces down to just a combo of an extremely powerful warrior and a magician. Aldebaran, even so, it's still 100 times more troublesome than any regular difficulty. Grumbling his complaints like curses, Aldebaran carefully surveyed the two, Ezo, who was keeping a watchful eye on his movements, and Garfield, who had regained composure at Ezo's words. They had prepared an exceedingly burdensome attitude. That was why? Garfield, why you bastard? Ezo, such a foolish act. Listening to the shocked voices of Garfield and Ezo, Aldebaran crumbled to his knees. Collapsing forward onto the floor, all strength fading from his body as he tumbled down the library steps, copious amounts of blood gushing out from the base of his helmet. Question mark, please wait, Garfield-kun. It would be perilous to approach heedlessly. The moment that Ezo had called out to keep Garfield in check, Aldebaran grabbed the bookshelf beside him and heaved it down to launch an attack on Ezo, who was further down on the steps, with a domino effect. Normally, the bookshelves of Taygeta would be held down by the weight of the books of the dead and would thus not easily fall over, but that would change altogether were there to be stones stealthily wedged underneath the bookshelves. 397. From the outset, he had intended to utilize this place as a battlefield. Given the abundance of obstacles and ease of making preparations here, he had long completed all of his preparations. Every time they got suspicious, he just had to send it forth to the next opportunity. Ezo, shit. As the bookshelves collapsed towards him, Ezo swiftly gave rise to a gale, forcibly stopping the domino effect, and attempting to cease damage from befalling the books of the dead falling to the floor. That concern for the books was quite admirable, but Aldebaran, Donya. Subsequently, the bookshelves to Ezo's left, right, and rear were all knocked over, surrounding him on all sides. With that wave of collapsing shelves and the avalanche of books, Ezo ultimately gave up on protecting the books with a great amount of anguish, and from there rode upon the wind to jump out of the way, escaping damage. Garfield, Sensei-san. Then, a Garfield who had not been held back by Ezo widened his eyes and faced Aldebaran with an expression of pure rage. At the emerald green eyes flaming with frenzied indignation, Aldebaran doubled down. In his hand, between his middle, ring, and pinky fingers was grasped a black orb, and lifting his helmet with the two fingers that remained, he thrust it into the gap. Aldebaran, gulp, though it was quite large and gave the absolute worst feeling as it passed through his throat, he forced it down into his stomach. Garfield, yah, based ah. Having witnessed that act, Garfield surrendered himself to the eruption of fury and charged forward. At that sensation of a powerful, troublesome gale pursuing him at speeds the eye could not keep up with, Aldebaran was sent flying by a punch while harboring the conviction that he had successfully severed the cooperation of his opponents and eliminated Garfield's composure. An unrelenting fist boring into his internal organs, dinner spilled back out to the interior of his helmet as he felt like he was about to vomit up the orb that had just entered his belly, and he bit down on his molars. And then, Aldebaran, expand territory, matrix redefinition. Once again, he declared war against the world. Rage had painted Garfield's vision completely red. A part of that rage was directed at Al, who had transformed Subaru and Beatrice into a black sphere, but the larger part of it was aimed at his own pathetic self. Garfield had had an important role entrusted to him by Otto, Emilia, and the others. All of them were eager to be with Subaru, who had finally returned from the Wallachian Empire. However, everyone had their own roles they had to fulfill, so they had swallowed their various emotions and entrusted everything to Garfield. Of course, Beatrice, Petra, and Mey, who had accompanied them, also held roles they were expected to play. Even so, Garfield's role had been to ensure Subaru's safety. That was why, Garfield, my amazing self's fucking dumb bayass. His molars, cracked from intense clenching, were repaired by the divine protection of earth spirits, only to then crack again from the continued clenching. That, truly, was the extent of Garfield's rage. He had been keeping a close eye on Al's actions, bearing in mind Ezo's opinion, which he had heard at the top of the tower. He was strongly aware that he needed to keep a close watch on Al to make sure he did not do anything reckless with Subaru and company. But, at the same time, Garfield had someone else to keep his eye on other than Al. It was none other than Subaru himself. Listen, Garfield. Please keep a close eye on Natsuki-san. While he most likely will not act recklessly because of Priscilla-sama, he might inadvertently do anything in his power for Al-san. Garfield, HK. The caution instilled in him by the one who was like his older brother had been slightly dulled by the additional caution he had received later. As a result, Garfield's reaction to Al's activity had been half a step late. Al had made the most out of that half step, as if he had seen through it perfectly. No, it was not only that half step that Al had anticipated. He had seen through the entire stride beyond that as well. Garfield, roar! The back fist of the roaring Garfield was narrowly dodged by his opponent, who had crouched just in time. The power of the strike was reduced to him merely grazing the enemy with the underside of his little finger, causing Garfield to grit his teeth. He kept missing. No matter how many punches he threw, he could not land a clean hit with a single one. As for his opponent, Aldebaran, Donya, a brief incantation, and the sensation of magic interfering with the world, made Garfield's hair stand on end as his body leaned forward. In the subsequent moment, a block of stone that had appeared airborne struck Garfield's face with a noticeable impact, as if to meet the angle at which he had tilted his head. A pained groan escaped his mouth, and his lip was split. In terms of power, it was a weak blow. For Garfield, who had fought against high-class warriors in the Empire, who had even clashed with a dragon, it was far from enough to incapacitate him, let alone cause a significant injury. However, he did not believe that this was the result of his opponent holding back. Aldebaran, huff, breathing heavily, Al, who had cast the spell that had struck Garfield's face, remained on guard without a hint of relaxation. His apparent exhaustion was not a ruse to induce Garfield's carelessness, he was genuinely out of breath. It was only a matter of course. According to Garfield's assessment, the difference in ability between them was so significant that Al would be incapacitated by even a single powerful blow. Perhaps, it would not even require a powerful blow. If even one of Garfield's barrage of punches were to land, it would terminate the fight. In the span of a single breath, he could unleash dozens of such finishing blows. Needless to say, facing such a situation would drain both one's mental and physical strength, even though that ought to go without saying. Garfield, it just won't hit. HK. Bewildered, Garfield was unable to make heads or tails of what was occurring to him. Al's movements and counterattacks revealed a significant gap in skill when compared to Garfield. This was not a matter of arrogance, but rather because, as a warrior, Garfield was far superior to Al, and yet, attacks that should have landed, and evasions that should have been successful, were failing completely. Garfield's attacks continued to miss, while Al's attacks continued to land. While they lacked the power necessary to critically injure Garfield, the bothersome attacks were sufficient to halt his movement and to prevent follow-up strikes. Garfield-kun, step aside. I will provide support. Once again, Garfield's progress was thwarted by a sinking force beneath his feet. As if scolding Garfield, who was unable to continue his attack, Ezo, shouting at him and advising him to keep his distance, had come to his aid with magical cover from the rear. For a moment, he considered following Ezo's words to assess Al's perplexing strategy. Aldebaran, yeah, that's it, back off. Fall back and run crying to your sis and Nana, Garf-chan. Garfield, I'll fucking crush ya. Just as he was about to pull back, those taunting remarks shattered his thoughts into 1,000 fragments. Garfield's vision turned vermilion with rage as he swung his arms wide and charged at Al. This time, he was determined not to stop for anything, no matter the interference. If his arms and legs were dodged, he would just ram his whole body into him and grapple him down. Aldebaran, honestly, that'd be the toughest thing to deal with. Sensing Garfield's intent, Al muttered with a heavy breath. Garfield planted his foot firmly on the ground, fearing any earth manipulation beneath him. He then launched himself forward with a swift kick, propelling his body forward. Garfield's body approached directly toward Al with tremendous force. Suddenly, his vision blurred. Garfield, Gar. A familiar sensation struck Garfield's eyes, and a groan escaped his throat. It was the same feeling he'd had upon encountering the sand wind in the sand sea on their way to the tower. Tiny grains of sand had flown into Garfield's eyes, mercilessly robbing him of his sight. Yet another of Al's dirty tricks. It was enough to make him stop in surprise. Unless he was determined that his arms and legs would not waver, no matter what, Al had been most wary of this reckless assault. As such, even with his sight having been snatched away, the best course of action for Garfield was to latch onto him with some part of his body and rob him of his combat ability. Ezo, Garfield-kun. Just as he decided to continue his assault, Ezo's desperate voice called out to him. Hearing Ezo's voice warning of danger, Garfield felt something closing in straight towards his nose. He opened his mouth wide and caught it with his fangs. A full-force punch aimed to crush Garfield's face right after he had been blinded, meant to bait him in. But that was not enough to break Garfield's resolve to do whatever it took. Garfield, I'll fix if Lair, Dumbus. With the sensation of his fangs sinking into the fist and stopping it, Garfield tightened his jaw, promising to heal Al after stripping him of his ability to do battle. It was a cold-blooded decision, but Al was one-armed. He fought with only his right arm, and were he to be robbed of the function of his one remaining arm, he would no longer be able to fight. So, Garfield intended to rip it apart from the wrist to the elbow. Garfield, as he increased his bite force, he realized something. The fist Garfield caught in his bite was shaped like Al's left hand, which he should not have. Garfield, In the next instant, Al's fist in Garfield's mouth swelled up violently, shattering his jawbone under the pressure and sending shards of his upper and lower canines flying through the air. Furthermore, the fingers that had extended into his mouth jabbed deep into Garfield's throat, triggering an unbearable gag reflex, a response triggered when fingers are thrust down one's throat, and paralyzing him. Then, a calculated, hard, and heavy blow struck Garfield's jaw diagonally. Garfield, Blinded and thrown into blackness, Garfield felt the sensation of his whole world flipping upside down. Having been struck on the jaw, his brain rattled, and his sense of balance vanished, making it impossible to stay on his feet as his knees buckled. Being utterly overwhelmed so one-sidedly, Garfield belatedly realized something. Ezo's desperate cry had been a deliberate warning, anticipating that if Garfield were to take Al's attack head-on, this would be the result. In other words, this all had been Al's bait. Aldebaran, remember when I said recklessness is the toughest thing to deal with? I lied. Those who don't think ain't a threat to me. The frustration and humiliation from those taunting words continued to paint Garfield's thoughts a deeper and deeper shade of red. A relentless, successive onslaught like a storm or tornado, for a person at its mercy, being blown away like a leaf or a twig would be the only outcome. To that extent, such a battle should have been one-sided. The results, to the contrary, favored the opposite side. Ezo, Garfield Kun, witnessing such an anomaly materializing before his very eyes, Ezo cried out from behind Garfield. Garfield, swinging his arms wide, had charged forwards at Al, to prevent him from escaping. He could clearly see his field of vision being robbed by a thin veil of sand that had been spread into his path. There was no magical reaction. This simple blinding of sand had come from outside the tower, the result of scattering sand taken from the stairs that rise from the sand sea. Subsequently, catching sight of the attack that followed that blinding, Ezo had screamed. Al had used magic to reconstruct his missing arm out of earth, and had thrown a punch with it. Garfield opened his mouth wide and attempted to bite down upon the arm of earth, but that would only end poorly. Ezo's grim premonition proved true, for the earthen arm violently exploded within Garfield's mouth. Garfield, bark! The expanding arm destroyed the inside of Garfield's mouth, and a spray of fangs and blood followed. To add to that, having encased his right hand in a gauntlet of stone, Al delivered a powerful sideways punch to the jaw of the stupefied Garfield. Garfield collapsed to his knees. His successive movements were efficient, extremely so. Ezo, something of this sort should not be possible, even in pre-arranged sparring. Ezo's vigilance continued to rise to its zenith as Al brilliantly halted Garfield's advance with a barrage of blows, strikes that would have been impossible to execute even if the sequence had been part of a martial arts demonstration. However, if Garfield had stopped his movements, it would be rather fortuitous. Ezo, any scope for underestimating you as someone of a lesser rank no longer exists. Not just that left arm of yours, be prepared to lose at least one leg. Ul-Shiha, being unable to unleash it thus far due to his concern for Garfield, who had been fighting in close quarters with Al, he attempted to rob his opponent of their combat strength with powerful magic. Conforming to Ezo's incantation, the mana that was released intervened in accordance with its magic formula, and the world was rewritten. What was then unleashed was a fierce torrent of wind. Disguised as a water-manipulating Shiha class incantation, this was a faux incantation that, in practice, could alter the magic that had actually been invoked. In addition, combining that faux incantation with a voicelessly incanted goa, a trap in the form of a pincer attack, from both the front and the rear, had been set. The simultaneous casting of two different spells was a highly advanced technique, to the extent that it was said to only be possible if one had two brains to think it through, and there were no more than 5 individuals in the entire world who could achieve it. Compared to Roswell, who was one among them, the presence of a momentary gap in Ezo's simultaneous casting was undeniable. However, it fell within the scope of what could be compensated for through the combined use of faux incantation and voiceless incantation. Ezo, with this, even if not decisive, it would still deliver a fatal blow. Such was Ezo's assessment, but it was completely painted over by Al's actions thereon. Without hesitation, Al turned his back upon the rampage of the invisible wind that approached from before him, and while taking the onrush of that wind upon his back, plunged into the blazing inferno behind him. Of course, this firepower was not meant to incinerate, but if one were to be directly hit, serious burns would be inevitable. Within that, Al was defenseless. He shaped the stone gauntlet on his right arm into a thin shield, breaking through that inferno head-on. Aldebaran, even if he could break through that wall of flame, he would still be caught in the wind and blown away. Immediately, Al would have been swept away by the wind, and his entire body would have slammed against the walls and floor, rendering him unable to move. However, Ezo, ludicrous, muttering so in a stunned voice, Ezo could not believe the unrealistic scene occurring right before his very eyes. Swept up by the wind, Al was indeed helpless as his whole body slammed into multiple places within the tower. However, as if anticipating each of the points of collision, Al created cushions of mud, almost completely killing the force of impact, and he escaped the grip of the wind. Ezo, the situation had arrived at such a point where Ezo was left with no choice but to give his most absurd speculations some actual consideration. His skills as a warrior were clearly inferior to those of Garfield, and he had even dodged the surefire attack from Ezo, the kingdom's finest magician, so there surely was some kind of rule-breaking technique that lay hidden beneath. If he were to guess, what was most likely would be, Ezo, unbelievable. An extremely short-term observation into the future, at the fact that such a ridiculous possibility required serious examination, Ezo could not help but feel a shiver down to his core. It was said that, amongst outstanding warriors and martial artists, there were those who could read into the presence of their opponents and intuitively discern their next move. Even in the world of magicians, it was theoretically possible to predict an opponent's next move by observing the form and nature of the mana that had been intently refined just prior to the spell being cast. However, the phenomena surrounding Al could not be fully explained by such theories alone. This was not something as simple as intuition or experience. He had the optimal solution for everything. With all due respect, Ezo, as an educator, was privileged with the opportunity to impart knowledge onto others. From that perspective, he was well aware that unnatural explanations were accompanied by unnatural processes. An explanation that skipped over the required processes to arrive at an answer was often revealed to be a surreptitious peek at the right answer. In other words, the same possibility might have been applicable to the phenomenon brought about by Al. The problem was, Ezo, the possibility of unknown magic, besides the one used to seal away Nastuki Dono and Miss Beatrice, magic that even Ezo, who had read through all available literature, and had acquired the knowledge of nearly every magic currently in existence, was unaware of. If it was a sort of forbidden technique that did not remain in records, there was a strong possibility that magic techniques that did not conform to the 6 basic attributes had been devised. Ezo, he could read any and all moves. Bearing this in mind, Ezo raised his estimation of the threat posed by Al to the maximum possible level. A formidable foe, wielding an unknown magic with unknown intentions, no longer was regarding him with such a description appropriate. The degree of danger he posed ought to have been considered equivalent to that of a Sin Archbishop or a witch. Hence, Ezo, while I still have the mana to spare, I shall clinch victory. When she first heard the thunderous roar, Petra did not want to believe it was real. However, Petra, she bit the inside of her cheek to wake herself up with the pain. The desire to believe was dangerous. People tend to easily drift towards the easiest, most comfortable, and safest options. But if something bad happens, what would one do? Would this mean that one would put something or someone important in danger for the sake of one's own momentary selfishness? Petra, Mei-chan, over here. With that, Petra pulled Mei, who had been helping to clean up after dinner, over to her. As usual, Mei was only getting in the way and not helping at all, but it was good that she was there. Thanks to that, she was able to offer her hand. As Mei was pulled along by Petra, she looked up at the ceiling where she heard the sound. Mei, Petra-chan, it seems like some people are having a fight. Petra, can you tell who they are? Mei, I don't know W. But Oniai-san and Fang Oniai-san have no reason to fight GHT, so it must be either Sensei-san or Helmet Oji-san. Re-GHT? Petra, Al-san and Ezo-san. Mei, if it's Sensei-san, then we have to be careful of that flam girl too. In contrast to Petra's heightened tension, Mei's tone and expression remained the same as usual. The difference between Mei, who was used to this kind of situation, and Petra, who was not, was clear. Still, Petra was lucky that she had experience from her time in the Empire, so she did not lose her composure. Petra's life had to benefit from the events in the Empire, even if only a little. Mei, what should we do? Should we go up too? Petra, well, let's not do that. If we were there from the beginning, it would be one thing, but if we try to join in now, we'll just get in the way. Meili, I guess that's good enough. I could send the little crimson scorpion Chan to keep guard, Booty. Responding to Meili's nonsensical statement, the scorpion in question crawled out of her hair and snapped its pincers. While it was good that they were so aggressive and motivated, it did not seem like a small scorpion like that would be of any use. It would not be much different if Petra and Meili went. Petra shook her head and put a damper on little crimson scorpion's enthusiasm. On top of that, Petra, we need to be prepared for anything that might happen. Based on what Meili said, it is highly likely that someone was fighting on an upper floor in the library where the books of the dead were kept. There were people who had headed there to work after dinner, and naturally, the two people Meili mentioned were included, and one of them was Natsuki Subaru. Petra, Subaru. As if she were praying, Petra wished for his safety. Beside him were Beatrice and Garfield. With those two by his side, she hoped that he would be much safer than if she was there herself. Just then, Petra. Meili, Petra, Garfi-san. Without warning, Petra leapt to her feet at the sound of Garfield's thunderous voice. Upon hearing Petra's reply, Garfield rushed into the room where Petra and the others were. Petra was delighted to see a familiar face, but she could not afford to even express such. Petra, you're badly hurt. What happened? You need to get medical treatment right away. Garfield, now, hurry up and chaz some yang magic on me. Rigged away. Petra, Garfield, with his face covered in blood and several teeth missing, makes his appeal, and Petra momentarily tensed up before immediately strengthening Garfield's body with yang magic. Her unrefined yang magic was an unstable thing to use on someone other than herself, but Garfield's fierce expression left her no choice. In that case, Petra had no choice but to overcome her immaturity right here and now. Garfield, Meili, while under the effect of Petra's yang magic, Garfield then forcibly thrust his hands into the floor of the room and tore up the stone flooring with brute strength. A shriek escaped Meili's lips at Garfield's incomprehensible actions, and then asked him, what are you doing? As he lifted the floor that he had just removed. In response, Garfield turned around to the entrance of the room and, Garfield, dish. After roaring indistinctly, Garfield blocked the entrance to the room with a piece of flooring he had torn up. Petra wanted to question him about what had happened, thinking that he was trying to prevent anyone from coming in. However, she quickly realized that wasn't the issue at hand. The reason Garfield had blocked the entrance became clear from what could be seen through the gap beneath the sealed door. Meili, what? Once again, Meili screamed, and the small red scorpion on her head also stretched its pincers and tail to the heavens in surprise. Petra's round eyes widened as she looked beyond the entrance blocked by Garfield, and she could hear and feel the presence of the muddy torrent of water that flooded the hallway of the tower's fourth floor with tremendous force. Why was it made, for what purpose, and by whom? Garfield, if you're reading here, then how boo an attack you can block even if you know it's coming? Garfield's cheeks contorted as he braced his feet against the floor and continued to withstand the force of the raging water. Petra was horrified by Garfield's vicious, belligerent smile mixed with anger. Who exactly was Garfield fighting with such an expression on his face, and why had he rushed alone to Petra and Meili? Petra, hang in there. Biting back the many questions that filled her chest, Petra reached out to support Garfield's back. Garfield, with Petra's hand on his back, Garfield's entire body tensed up with strength. Of course, Petra's slender arms could never add to Garfield's strength. She would have been far more useful if she had concentrated on her yang magic, but at that moment, Petra entrusted all her worries and faith to Garfield's back, and Garfield, she believed, tried his best to respond to that trust with all his might. Eventually, the sound of the massive torrent of water rushing through the passageway began to subside, gradually turning into a faint trickle, like the last drops of water falling from a gutter after a rainstorm. Garfield, who had been holding his ground, relaxed his legs and pushed the stone slab he had used to block the entrance to the side, and let out a deep breath. He then began to turn around to face Petra, who was still touching his back. Garfield come here. Upstairs, not to the Taygeta side. Perhaps this was also an application of magic, but Ezo's voice was so loud that it was hard to tell how far away he was, and Garfield, who had been called, looked up as if snapped into motion. His usual sharp fangs were broken, and for a moment, he wondered whether he should explain the situation to Petra and Mey. Garfield, Mey and Ya. I'll explain later. Petra. Is it Al-san? Garfield, yeah. Without saying much, he only managed to share who had started it, and then Garfield rushed out into the wet corridor to meet up with Ezo. She watched until his back disappeared, and then Petra let out a shaky breath and covered her face with her hands. Petra, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry, don't cry. Desperately trying to dispel the rising dread within her, Petra repeated the words to herself over and over, but even so, she couldn't stop the feeling from welling up inside her. Mey, Petra-chan. Mey gently, and without warning, placed a hand on Petra's head, which was still buried in her palms. Then she ruffled up her hair, and Petra thought it was annoying, but later, she realized that Mey was just terrible at petting people's heads, and while clumsily consoling Petra, Mey let out a small sigh. Mey, maybe it's my foul LT. Not everyone can be saved by Oni-san and Oni-san's kindly SS. Petra, that's not. She wanted to say it wasn't true, to deny it completely. But instead, a sob came first, and she found herself unable to muster the confidence to fully reject Mei's words. Upon being assailed by the muddy stream that flooded the hallway, his opponents having discovered a truly optimal strategy, bereft of effect from any of his provocations and excuses, Aldebaran was struck with a sense of powerlessness. Despite possessing such a cheat technique, despite possessing such an advantage, he was being pursued oh so intensely by people who had mastered the art of countering it. In regards to that strength, he could not help but be impressed, all excuses aside. Aldebaran, boo. The torrent of water left him no escape, forbidding him from planting his legs or grabbing hold of something, so Aldebaran's body was washed away, mercilessly robbing him of his strength and body temperature. The more he attempted to struggle against the water, the more his strength would be taken away, relentlessly being exhausted. The water pouring in from the orifices in his entire body washed it all thoroughly, with him unable to do a thing. Unlike wind, which had a certain degree of direction, dealing with the flow of water by way of walls and structures fashioned from earth was indeed impossible. Henceforth, what Aldebaran could do was to get swept up by the water, to be jostled about by the water, and to be killed by the water, and nothing more beyond that. In reality, he had no idea just how much water he had ended up swallowing. Only, Aldebaran, bar. HK. While gurgling, throwing up the water he had swallowed, Aldebaran took heavy breaths. Body void of strength, he supported and lifted himself with his single arm, doing his best to rid his body of the water that had filled him, so much so that he had been on the verge of bursting like a water balloon. From his nose, mouth, eyes, and ears, it felt as if water was streaming out. No longer could he feel his lower body, and he was too afraid to ascertain if he had urinated or soiled himself. And then, after expelling, vomiting as much water as he could. Well then, you should not have any further strength with which to resist, but let us hear you explain yourself. Having slowly ascended the staircase, the magician and warrior looked down at Aldebaran. Powerless to stop it, Aldebaran had been knocked about while being swept up the staircase. Though the two who had imposingly climbed up those stairs were fatigued, they remained with more than enough will to fight. Conversely, Aldebaran was soaked like a ragged, drowned rat, his entire body covered in wounds. Aldebaran, languidly did Aldebaran collapse, having relaxed the arm that was supporting his body, now lying face up. In the sky where the sun was setting, where the curtain of night was beginning to fall, the glow of stars scattered around was visible. Feeling as if the flickering stars above were looking down on him, Al loathed the heavens from the bottom of his heart. Stars were something he hated. Stars, looking down upon the surface from high above, merely shining as they pleased, was something he hated. Captain and Beatrice, jib 'em back, so declared Garfield, who was missing a few fangs, to the upward-facing Aldebaran. His attitude of prioritizing Natsuki Subaru and Beatrice instead of complaining about the mess that had been made of his mouth was admirable, and something that Aldebaran almost wanted to root for, but unfortunately, their views were diametrical opposites of one another. he really did find it sorrowful. Aldebaran did not particularly hate Garfield, he did not hate any of them, he hated neither Garfield, nor Ezo, who he had just fought against, nor did he hate Petra, nor Mey, nor Flam, who were present in this tower, nor did he hate any of the people he would probably end up fighting against hereafter. The only ones he hated were himself, and Natsuki Subaru. Garfield, oi, bastard, you're listening, Ezo, please calm down, Garfield-kun. Even if you consider his silence as a provocation here, Aldono cannot help it. In addition, the provocation would be meaningless. He ought to understand by now. Garfield, Ezo, it seems that you somehow possess the ability to utilize an unknown magic. A type of forbidden art, but that is not to say it is omnipotent. Whether it be I, or likely somebody else, it shall be countered. No matter how skilled you may be in the art of war, you cannot win all your battles. Keeping the emotional Garfield in check, Ezo spoke, rational to the bitter end. Those words were quite persuasive to Al, with whom Ezo had done as he pleased till the current time. Through his definite strength and perceptiveness, Ezo had defeated Aldebaran's authority. At this moment, since Aldebaran could not even lift a single finger, he could not make excuses. It was just that, Aldebaran, Ezo Dono, it's precisely as you say. I can't win every battle. Still lying on his back, Aldebaran affirmed Ezo's words. At that comment, Garfield and Ezo each displayed their own unique reactions. Garfield showed frustration, and Ezo showed increasing vigilance. That they did not lose their focus even after he had declared such, vexed him. It vexes me, but it's fine. After all, she's no longer among us. 748. That was the number of attempts in which he had drifted aimlessly, all while experiencing a sense of helplessness at not being able to do anything in particular. The only variable he had been able to test had been the place towards which the muddy current would sweep him away. After being washed away by the water, there was nothing Aldebaran could do, tiny as he was. Instead, until he drew the winning ticket, on and on and on and on, he was washed away without end. And then, at long last, he drew it. Aldebaran, I can't win every battle. That's why, I just gotta win the final one. Ezo, what are you? Aldebaran, I wanted to get over here. This place is my one and only victory condition. Ignoring Ezo and Garfield as question marks floated above their heads, Aldebaran continued so. He did not have the time to wait for a reply. Even now, he was just spewing any nonsense he could think of as to keep himself from losing consciousness. Neither was he boasting of success, nor did he intend to pester them with a declaration of victory. Merely, he wished for them to understand. Just a portion of all the stardust Aldebaran had piled up, he wished for them to understand. Aldebaran, as the pair gave off signs of bewilderment, Aldebaran, still lying on the floor, raised his arm, and pointed in a certain direction. Realizing that something had fallen at the place towards which Aldebaran was pointing, Ezo and Garfield's throats both choked up. That was clear. Even if they did not comprehend the significance of that being here, they likely had gained a sense of unease. That was, Garfield, is that a Book of the Dead? Ezo, whose, albeit having been submerged, that Book of the Dead was one which yet maintained the form of a book. While gazing at its sodden pages, lying on the floor in an open state, the eyes of the two widened in shock, their voices trembled. They had yet to reach comprehension. And frankly, even supposing they heard the answer, they likely would not understand its meaning. But, from the very start, Aldebaran had come to the tower in order to search for that book, and put it to use. After all, he knew that there would be no other way to make the preparations in order to remove Natsuki Subaru. The title of that Book of the Dead, inscribed there was, Aldebaran, it's my name. Ezo and Garfield. The correct answer revealed to them, Ezo and Garfield were overwhelmed by a momentary pause. While that was a clear opening, Aldebaran unfortunately did not have the strength to reap its benefits. This once-in-a-lifetime opportunity was not something that Aldebaran could seize. Therefore, he would entrust the act of utilizing this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to Aldebaran. Looking down upon the soaked pages of the Book of the Dead lying on the floor had been eyes. Those eyes slowly rose up and faced the four. And then, clad in scales of pale azure, the life form considered to be the strongest in the entire world spread its wings, and pronounced, "Your stars were bad." The subsequent instant, aiming at the magician and warrior, both frozen in place, the breath of the divine dragon Volcanica, nay, of the divine dragon Aldebaran, was mercilessly unleashed.